lot of ideas. And it's a great pleasure and honour to have with us today Case and Angus Deaton. Anne is the Alexander Stewart 1886 Professor of Economics and Public Affairs Emeritus at Princeton University. And Angus is the Dwight D. Eisenhower Professor of Economics and International Affairs Emeritus, also at Princeton. And he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2015. Both have put together this incredible book, Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism, published by Princeton University Press. Martin Wolf in the Financial Times this week called it a book of the highest importance. And it is. It deserves the widest readership. And its findings are relevant to what we have in the United Kingdom, as they are in the United States and elsewhere, as the book focuses on. I'm going to be talking with Angus and Anne as we go through this, and we'll also be putting questions that you put to them. Please post a question in the question box at the bottom, and also vote on the questions you'd like to see asked, and we'll try and get to as many as we can. I should warn listeners and viewers that we're talking about issues that include suicide and alcoholism and early death, and there are various organisations that we've listed in the chat box and also on our website that you can call to get further help. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome, Anne and Angus. Thanks for joining us. Could we start? A few weeks ago, you would have been in Bristol giving this event, but of course, circumstances have moved on. Can you start by telling us what deaths of despair are? Anne, do you want to start with that?
Sure. So when we started looking at the work on why mortality rates were rising in midlife, what we found were that the three causes of death that were rising most rapidly were for suicide, drug overdose, and alcoholic liver disease. And while drug overdose and alcoholic liver disease are not suicide, they are all death by one's own hand. And they all have something in common, which is that they all, to us, represent a great deal of despair. So as a shorthand, so that we didn't have to keep rattling off those three causes of death, we called them deaths of despair, and the press picked that up, and it's now become kind of part of the regular press language.
And who, Angus, who's affected by this? I mean, it predominantly the white working class.
Yeah, so that we noticed this from the very early stages, because we're economists, we're social scientists, and you want to investigate, what are the correlates of these deaths? And you're somewhat limited in that because, of course, it doesn't say on the death certificate what you did in life or, how much you earned or something. But what it does say over the last 30 years in the US is, what the highest level of education was. So we sort of split this up by, people had a 4-year college degree, which is the key thing here. It's a bit different from in Britain, but that 4-year BA, as opposed to a 2-year college, for instance, is a key cutoff. And it turns out it really separates these two groups. And nearly all of these deaths of despair, all three of them, and for men and women as well, were conditioned on people not having this 4-year degree, of which there are only about a third of the people in the US who have a 4-year degree, but those thirds seem to be exempt from this plague.
And we're talking some quite staggering numbers here, aren't we, Anne, of early deaths? The one in 2017, 158,000 deaths through deaths of despair.
Yes, it's a stunning number. And in retrospect, it's kind of stunning that it's been under the radar for so long. These deaths started to climb back in the early 1990s, but it wasn't until they got to be large enough that suddenly people started to take note of them. For the US, our deaths from COVID this year so far are in the 120,000s. So the idea that year in and year out, there's an epidemic afoot where people are dying in larger numbers, and they will probably continue to die in those large numbers long after there's a vaccine for COVID. So we think that this is something that we can't lose sight of because we don't see a reason why it's going to go away by itself.
Now, why has this happened then? You go through many reasons why why this has happened in the United States, and one of them is about the destruction really of blue collar, what was called the blue collar aristocracy, the blue collar jobs. Angus.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And to some extent, that's happening elsewhere too. So, we've had this, globalization and automation, which are the big forces here, are affecting workers in all rich countries, including in Britain and including even in Germany. There's no exemption from this. And that has made it really tough for less skilled labor everywhere. And in Britain, for instance, I think since the recession, maybe even a little bit before that, there's been essentially no increase in real wages at the median worker. In America, we've had a decline for people without a BA for 50 years now. So the difference between Britain and the US in this context is really just a matter of time in some sense.
Partially just a matter of time,
Yes.
but also partially the fact that even though wages have not been rising in Britain, the transfer programs there tend to make families whole, so that there hasn't been an increase in the difference between the haves and have-nots the way there has been in the US.
At least in terms of post-tax income,
Yeah.
because the welfare state makes up a lot more than it would do here in the United States.
And with the so economic reasons, and you talked about 1970 as being the kind of pivotal year when things began to change. What was it about that year when things began to change?
Well, that was sort of the first wave of globalization hitting the US in terms of automobiles coming in from Japan and coming in from Germany. And that was the high watermark for blue collar wages was actually 1972. And they've been falling since then.
And there's been a big decline in unions since that time too. Also something that's happening, throughout the Western world. So this is, it's a peculiarly American disaster in that these deaths of despair are really not showing up elsewhere. There's a little bit in Britain, but on a much, much smaller scale. But it's not that's the thing that's different. And so there's two levels of story here. And one is these general phenomena that are affecting the rich world, globalization, automation. But then what is it about America that's making it so much worse to the point where people are doing themselves in or are susceptible to these drug overdoses? So a lot of the book is about that.
And what about other factors that you mentioned in the book? So what about home life and family life? What's been the big shifts there, and what's happened there?
Well, we've seen real deterioration in the stability of home life for people without a bachelor's degree in the US. Since 1980, the fraction of people without a BA who are married has been falling. And our friends in sociology tell us that's largely a result of the fact that people are not able to find good jobs, and they want to wait until at least one person in the couple has a good job before they tie the knot. So they move in together, but unlike Europe, the cohabitations in the US are really fragile. So people move in together, they may have a child, but then they split up. The child moves with the mom, the father may not see the child. And there are these serial cohabitations that are quite fragile.
And in Britain, lots of people do live together without the benefits of legal marriage. But they're much more stable throughout continental Europe and Britain than they are in America. So, we see this sort of causal chain as the work environment goes away, the good jobs are gone or going, and the wages are going down. And that's what that's the sort of basic underpinning, if you like, of white working class life. And as you remove those underpinnings one at a time, the mine starts falling in behind you sort of idea, and it causes an enormous amount of distress.
It's also the case that community life has deteriorated enormously. So in many towns, the union hall would have been the center of community life. But with the union jobs gone, that source of connection also has deteriorated. And in the US, unlike in Europe, the institutions of organized religion has always been really important. And that's also gone by the wayside, that a very large minority of young white working class people report they're not affiliated with any church whatsoever. So without a family life, without the community life, without church, it's kind of a Durkheimian recipe for suicide.
And just on two more questions on what's behind this. The first is about jobs. You split out current, things like the precarious service economy. So someone who might have been employed by General Motors, say, who might have cleaned the factory or whatever, is now often in a service job. In an outsourced job. So they feel no real connection with the employer, and they don't benefit from the kind of softer aspects of the Christmas lunch and things like that. How important has that been in terms of loyalty and job satisfaction?
It's hard to quantify, but it's clearly part of this social disintegration, that you're not going to church anymore, you don't have a union anymore, you don't associate with people. People reporting a lot more loneliness, they're finding a lot more difficulty socializing, and there's a lot more pain in all its forms. I mean, social, as well as psychological pain, as well as physical pain, though nowadays people don't think there's much distinction. And once again, this is happening to the people who don't have this magic 4-year BA. And somehow, if you got this, you escaped from that.
Yeah. And Anne, healthcare is one of the big issues you talk about, and the woefully bad system that exists. I mean, we sometimes think, we're fortunate to have the National Health Service in Britain, and that's come into its own again recently with the COVID-19 crisis and so on. But you give some horrendous accounts of what's been happening, the number of opioid, the prescription levels and so on. And this is really at the heart of the problem, isn't it, for you?
Well, we focus on healthcare in part because it's something that we could do something about. So globalization and automation, we think, are probably in the end good things because they make the pie bigger. We can still argue about how to cut the pie, but we don't think necessarily we want to toy with those things. But for the US, the healthcare system is like an own goal. I mean, our healthcare system is the most expensive in the world, but our life expectancy is lower than in any other rich country. We spend twice as much per head as you do in the UK. And on many metrics, the UK reports people in better health than Americans. And we really want people to think about the cost of healthcare, because we think those outsourced jobs we just talked about in part came about because we have this system where we tie people's health insurance to their employer. And when it gets to be really expensive, the employer decides those low-skilled workers are too expensive now. We have to let them go.
So that's one of the major drivers of the outsourcing.
We certainly do want to come back to opioids, but we think that the cost, the ridiculous cost that we pay, is one of the things that we could do something about if we could find the political will to do it.
And we see the despair in some sense as being prior to the opioid crisis. So, one simple version of our story, which we don't think is correct, is that this is just a drug epidemic. That's really what we're talking about here. And, first of all, there were these opioids, pretty strong opioids, like what here is called Vicodin, I don't know what it's called in Britain, were available long before OxyContin was produced in the mid-90s, and there was no epidemic before that. But there's really evidence that the pharma companies, like Purdue Pharmaceutical in particular, sort of went to those areas where there was a lot of despair, places where coal mining had shut down, or places where manufacturing had shut down. And it brought enormous pressure to bear on doctors to prescribe enormous numbers of these pills. I mean, hundreds of millions of these pills. So that, at one point, every American had, or the number of prescription drugs out there, these opioids, was enough for every American to have a month's supply.
I want to bring in a question from a member of the audience here, which is about the balance of deaths between men and women, and how, the question refers particularly to a lot of the manufacturing jobs would have been done by men. What's the kind of balance between the deaths of despair between females and males?
It's a good question. Men are still more likely to kill themselves in any of those ways: suicide, drug overdose, alcoholism. But the trend lines between white working class men and women have been identical. So the increase in the death rate, women match 1-for-1 with the increase in that for men. And we think partly it's that the jobs for women, women's labor force participation in the US among people without a bachelor's degree peaked in 2000 and has been falling since then, as have wages for women as well. And we think that these downstream effects also of neither person in the couple having a good job, a job with prospects, affects both the men and the women.
And the marriage disintegration, that's men and women. And what Anne says is true. I mean, women have always been, and I think everywhere in the world now, China used to be the exception, but it isn't anymore. Women are less likely to kill themselves than men. So that's still true in the US. But if you plot the graphs of suicide for men and women, it looks like tram lines. They're just both going up together. So this is a catastrophe that's affected men and women together. And that's an important part of our story, that it's something that's to do with family life ultimately.
And just on another question is about race, and this is about white working class people that you're talking about. What about the position with black people, with Hispanics?
We grappled with the fact that whites, who were the ones who were succumbing to this, in many ways are the most privileged, right, by the color of their skin. They weren't the poorest, they weren't the least educated, but they were the ones for whom this was happening through the 90s and through the 2010s. And we got some advice on this actually from President Obama, who said to us that we should go back and look at what happened to African Americans in the 60s and 70s. And he was exactly right, we think, that in the 60s and 70s, during that first wave of globalization, manufacturing jobs left the inner cities. And that's the point at which marriage just collapsed in the inner cities for Blacks. Out of wedlock childbearing increased dramatically. They were hit with a drug epidemic, the crack epidemic. And we see this as being the real coming around again. And this time as it comes, it's coming for the white working class. So we think that it's just another shoe dropping here.
You asked about Hispanics, though, which is a sort of interesting case. And this is not happening to Hispanics either. I mean, in one of our graphs, the Hispanic death rates look exactly like British death rates. So you just don't see this catastrophe going on at all. First of all, Hispanics is not a group in the way that whites or African Americans are a group. They come from many different places. They're very heterogeneous. But the second thing is, this is a story of a long disintegration over a long period of time, starting in the 1970s. Many of these Hispanics were not here then, or their parents were not here then. So these are people who've come to the United States relatively recently. I mean, we're not talking about last week or whatever. And for them, this is still the land of opportunity, and this is not, they're not seeing this disintegration, though they may over long enough time. One of the things that's interesting is Black, what I think in Britain is called BAME, Blacks and other minority ethnicities, actually had lower death rates than whites before COVID. And COVID has turned that around so that the Blacks are now doing worse than the whites. So in that sense, in Britain, sorry, not here. Yeah. And in Britain, therefore, it's sort of interesting to speculate that many of those minorities in Britain are sort of like the Hispanics here, that they or their parents are first or second generation immigrants.
One person's asked a question. They'd like a little more information about what the advantage of a degree, a 4-year degree, gives people that stops this problem for them. I mean, one of the things is the sheer level of premium that you get. Obviously, they become much wealthier as a result of doing this degree. And I guess there's lots of things like social capital, networking, status, and so on that helps as well.
And better jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, so, as what economists like to call skill-biased technical progress is taking place, there's more and more demand for people who are more highly skilled. And so, the people with a 4-year degree have just not suffered the decrease in wages over time.
In fact, the opposite.
The
right?
opposite.
The wage premium of what you earn if you had this 4-year BA relative to just a high school degree. In 1980, there was a 40% premium. By 2000, it was an 80% premium. Now, economists would think that, like, when that happens, people should go out and get this college degree then. But what we didn't see the response that currently in Britain you're seeing of many, many more people getting a tertiary degree. And which makes us think also that there are severe barriers for people actually going on for the college degree. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's fine. Yeah, and I mean, it's a very strange thing when you think about it, because two things. I mean, one is, our economy has been growing for the last 20 or 30 years. GDP per head has gone up, but it's all gone to these educated people, and none of it's gone to the less educated people. Less educated people are much less likely to be in the labor force at all, because, they get bumped out of these good jobs, and during a bad time, during a recession, they hunt around a bit, but the next job they find, if they find a job at all, tends to be a little worse, or an outsourced job rather than a good job. Or they just say, I'm 55 years old, I'm not up for this anymore, I'm going to just stay out of this labor force. So you get this declining participation. And while the other people are making out like bandits. And it's very important to remember that these less educated people without a BA, are 2/3 of the population.
Yeah.
And among African Americans, they're 80% of the population. So, our education system just not doing a very good job.
I'm going to come on to solution now, but just one question which you already mentioned a little bit about, which is about, should we in Britain fear this happening or it getting worse? I mean, what's your view?
Yes, I mean, you should be afraid. You should be very afraid. And, because some of the symptoms are there, which is the stagnation of wages over a long period of time. The social safety net probably can't make this up forever. In the end, people want to earn their way. And they're delighted to be protected by the social safety net, but they don't want to be in the net all the time. And
it's a little more complicated though, right? Because there's no sort of equivalent to this 4-year degree, right? So people can leave their last formal education with certificates or with things that they can use in the labor market that can help them get good jobs. And in the US, leaving with a high school degree just doesn't have the same effect.
And there has been a huge increase in Britain in people getting university degrees in recent years.
Johann Mackenbach, who is at Rotterdam, has done something comparable to what we did, looking at mortality rates of people with and without tertiary education. When he does that for England and Wales, he doesn't find the same differential that we find, or the growth in the differential that we find. All of this is currently under review. I'm sitting next to someone who's running something called the Deaton Review on Inequalities for the UK. And I'm doing a little bit of the health work on that. And so all of this is currently being researched.
You also have two big things going for you. One is you have the national health system, so you don't have this horrible tax on every worker, which is you all pay for the national health system together. So that means you're paying for it sort of in proportion to what you earn. Whereas here, everybody sort of pays the same, and that's sort of a disaster. The second thing is you don't let pharma companies addict large chunks of the population with heroin that's been labeled with an official stamp of approval. So those are two things that you really have going for you. Of course, that does not protect you against illegal drugs like heroin, street heroin, and fentanyl. And there are certainly pockets of drug deaths in Britain. I'm afraid in Scotland, where I come from, there's a very serious problem. And so, we're of two minds about it. You don't have all the conditions that's made for the disaster here, but some of them are there.
Thank you. Just on some solutions, the first is about, you talk in the book that if 40 years ago you would have helped develop, you would have suggested a more generous safety net to help offset the growth of things like globalization and automation. What should we be doing for the next 40 years, do you think? I mean, one thing that's often floated, for example, and you talk about it in the book, is a universal basic income. But I think you're fairly skeptical about that.
Well, there's a very, very strong philosophical case for a universal basic income, which is that everybody should have, as it were, a grant of time, which is guaranteed by the state. If you like free leisure, everybody should have some time where they're not forced to earn, they're not forced into the market, and that gives people an enormous amount of liberty. I agree with that. But in the US, we have a lousy education system, we have a lousy healthcare system, and so it seems to me that you'd want to guarantee people health and you'd want to guarantee people education before you start worrying about giving people leisure. So that's one of the big arguments for me against doing it, certainly in the United States today. And people in the US are really, over and over again, people will not pay for other people's leisure. They will help pay for other people's health care because it might be their turn, or they might pay to go to school as a communal enterprise. But I don't think they're prepared to socialize leisure as yet, which is what the UBI does.
And Anne, what do we do about what can be done about the opioid crisis? And there was a review of your book by Atul Gawande where he's a doctor and he prescribed painkillers and wasn't aware or reassured patients that they wouldn't be addictive and so on. I mean, it's not just the doctor's responsibility, is it? It's others as well.
It's others as well. They have started to turn the taps off a bit on prescription opioids, but unfortunately the genie is really out of the bottle. So heroin, which is cheap and pure, is coming in from Mexico, and fentanyl is coming in from China, and those things are deadly. Combining those with the fact that deaths from suicide and alcoholic liver disease also continue to rise. I think that we certainly have to do everything we can to stop the prescription opioid problem, which is still with us. It's not as if the taps have been turned off, but we really need to focus on the upstream problems that are causing people this kind of despair. Mm-hmm. And we think that a large part of that could change if people thought they had hope for the future. And a lot of the hope for the future comes through having a job that you think has prospects. I mean, people, one of the ways they define themselves is through the work that they do. And in the US, people will say to us, I don't want a handout, I want a job. And I think that that's where we need to focus our attention is, what do we do to try to make use of all the skills that are out there that are currently going to waste.
And we need an education system that generates more than trying to get everybody into college, because only a third of people are going to college. And so the education has to produce a wider range of valorized skills so that, people come out of the educational system, whether it's just high school or beyond that, with skills and interests that enable them to lead a worthwhile life. And we're not doing a very good job of that.
And in the wider political arena, someone asked the question about, will Congress help change anything here? I mean, you talk about both Democrats and Republicans tending to vote for things in favor of certain groups of people. Have you got much confidence in the system changing?
No.
It's possible that COVID may break some things open. It's certainly the case that when people en masse went to the street to protest against racial injustice by the police, that things changed at the state levels, at least, very quickly. So it's possible that when people are smacked with tens of thousands of dollars of medical bills that they cannot pay because of COVID, people in the middle of the distribution may actually start to talk about, wait a minute, we really need to change the way that this is organized and this happens. The thing that makes us both, I think, despair is that this healthcare industry, which went from 5% to almost 20% of GDP between 1960 and 2020, has 5 lobbyists for every member of Congress. They're really powerful. They have a lot of money. And they are there, that they will fight to the last dime to try to make sure that they protect the industry.
And the record on this is not super good. Even on the police thing, it changed the law in New York. And Congress, the House of Representatives, voted to change the law, but the Senate is blocking it. And I don't think anything's going to happen. Some enormous fraction of Americans want gun control, but the Senate has blocked that for many, many years. And most Americans would like a better healthcare system, but the lobbyists are very powerful. We have a very undemocratic system in some ways with, the Senate is representative of the states, not of the people. So states that have very few people get the same number of votes as states that have enormous number of people.
And you still, though, believe in capitalism, don't you? It's still the best system for getting out. How would you reform capitalism to make this work?
Get the healthcare industry out of it for a start.
There's a lot of people in the US take one course in economics and they learn about markets and free markets, and they think the market will be the solution and the market has a price and that shows you where resources should move. Well, there are assumptions under what works well as a market, and the delivery of healthcare does not meet the assumptions necessary to treat it as if it were a free market. We've known that for a long time, but we continue to pretend in the US that, well, if only we could get the market to work properly. But we've got to join the rest of the rich world in realizing that that's not going to work well.
There are many more solutions put forward in your book. We're out of time. I've just got one final question, which is, you mentioned about the interest that President Obama took in your work. I don't suppose you've had a call from the current incumbent of the White House to chat through your findings?
You would be correct.
Okay. Perhaps
Anne might tell you a story. She's on the committee.
Oh, no.
All right.
Okay.
Well, she's on a committee which picks the national or recommend.
Okay, I'm on a committee that used to meet, that no longer meets, that stopped meeting after our current president took office. It's sort of symbolic of the fact that the likes of us are not particularly welcome in the current administration.
And that science has a very low priority in the White House.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining us. As I mentioned at the start, if you've been affected by any of the issues raised in this event, our website has details of organisations that may be able to provide health and advice. Our next online event is with Rachel Louise Snyder, 30th of June, on what we can do about domestic violence. And there's more to follow in the summer and the autumn. Just to repeat once again, if you'd like to follow this through, Deaths of Despair by Anne and Angus is published by Princeton University Press and is available from our partners at waterstones.com. And we can even now in this country, and I guess in the United States, actually go into a bookshop now and actually buy a book. They've opened up the bookshops, which is a step forward. So do read the book, and we'll be posting more information on the book on our social media platforms and also in our blogs. Thank you very much for attending. And thank you very much, Anne and Angus. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Stay well. Bye-bye.